The Federal Reserve has come to us in the past with concerns about the model that we have set up, especially since 1992, the GSE Act that passed the Congress here. Under that model, they were able to dive into the junk mortgage market and push, and they purchased over $1 trillion worth. They racked up leverage of 100 to 1. And part of the concerns here is that once you establish a GSE, you've established a huge quasi-governmental monopoly that comes in and lobbies the members. So the Fed came to us. They asked us to take some action in the Congress. I offered an amendment endorsed by the Fed that would authorize the regulator to rein in Fannie and Freddie on these mortgage portfolios based on the systemic risk that they posed. That was opposed by Fannie and Freddie, and of course it was defeated, as was Jim Leach's amendment. Jim Leach, the former chairman of this committee, offered an amendment to strengthen the minimum capital requirements for Fannie and Freddie. And Ron Paul offered an amendment to eliminate the ability of Fannie and Freddie to borrow from the Treasury. Any one of these, the Fed recognized, would have helped the situation. But once we create these entities, they come in, they lobby against those kinds of reforms. And indeed, the only reform we ever passed out of the House is one that was opposed by the Treasury and the Fed. Why? Because it made the situation worse. It tied the hands of the regulators even more. So here's the problem. We now have the president of the Richmond Federal Reserve, and Mr. Calabria, I'll ask you about this. He comes to us and he says, quote, we should phase out government guarantees for home mortgage debt. Now, clearly he doesn't mean tomorrow. He means phasing it out over a long period of time in order to make sure that we bring private capital back into the market. And he says, otherwise, financial stability will be elusive and fiscal balance will be threatened by repeated boom-bust cycles in housing. I was going to ask you, do you think government guarantees on mortgages exacerbate or mitigate the boom-bust cycle that we have experienced in the market?
I would 100% agree with the remarks of President Lacker. I think that our current system mortgage finance is pro-cyclical rather than counter-cyclical. And I think the point that you make, and I say this from having spent 7 years working in staff in the other body, I think any system we set up will erode over time. I mean, the reality is there will be another housing boom at some point in the future. We will all, again, think that housing is the best thing since sliced bread, and we will want to get everybody in, and we will push underwriting standards again down. It's happened time and time again. So I would 100% agree with that. While you could design a system today that if it just stayed that way might reduce the risk, I have very little confidence that it would stay that way over time.
Let me ask you another question. In your testimony, you call for shifting the FHFA from conservator to receiver for the GSEs, right?
Yes.
And I think among the points that you make, your argument is that it could be an instrumental step in combating the perception that other entities out there are too big to fail. And I know some think we've solved the too big to fail problem with the legislation passed last year, but a lot of economists think otherwise. And I thought I'd ask you to expand on that point and maybe explain to us how that transition process might occur, how you would envision us getting from point A to point B.
Sure. And let me start with the broader point about too big to fail. I mean, we have to recall that essentially every financial institution, whether it's Fannie Mae or Citibank, is primarily funded with debt. 90% plus of their funding is debt. And so it's all good and well to fire management and wipe out shareholders, but you will not have sufficient market discipline in that absence. So to me, to end too big to fail, again, whether it's Citi or whether it's Fannie, you have to set up a process where creditors take haircuts. And I think because we have not done that, and because in the last crisis under this administration and the last administration, the proposal was always to protect creditors. I think that's been a mistake. You can even, while you can argue maybe in a panic, I think going forward, post-panic, creditors need to take losses. And why? That's because as companies begin to take risk, whether it's incompetent management, whether it's a business strategy, those who provide funding will raise the cost of that funding and constrain them. I was always puzzled working on GSE issues that the more debt Fannie and Freddie issued, the lower their funding costs were.
Yeah, lower the costs.
Certainly
Yeah.
contrary to...
The bigger the share of the market they would take.
Exactly.
And I would argue, during the conference, I actually had an amendment to sort of guarantee a larger haircut. That was defeated in the markup in the conference committee. I think we need to revisit that issue on the too big to fail front. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.